Good evening. I'm Piotr Bednarski. I'm host of this program on Catholic Church, Society and Culture. I'm very glad to host today Professor Stephen Bullivant, who is our guest. We were waiting for you for almost 1 year, but we are very glad that you decided to join our program. I will be hosting this program for 90 minutes and we will cover a couple of themes. Professor Bullivant is a lecturer at St. Mary University in London, but he is also a lecturer and professor at Notre Dame University in Australia. He's a director of the St. Benedict XVI Centre for Religion and Society, and he authored 10 books, ranging from books on atheism, published by Oxford University Press, Cambridge University Press, on disaffiliation in Britain and America, very important theme also for Polish audience, and some other topics also on Fatima, on Trinities, and he's very active in media. I looked into various articles you wrote for Catholic Herald, National Catholic Register, your interviews to various media outlets. So you're very busy with a number of activities, having also a solid family. So Professor Bullivant, welcome warmly to our program, and we are very thankful that you agreed to spend with us this time.
No, thank you. I mean, I'm honored by the invitation. So thank you for having me.
This program is organized by EWTN Polska together with the Christian Center for Culture and Mary Our Queen, Late Catholic Association Przybądźcie Wierni. I will be running this interview with my colleague Zbigniew Przybyłowski, and we are supported by Paweł from EWTN Polska. Following our custom, we would like to start our meeting with prayer, Our Father in Latin, especially praying for the peace in the world, in the Holy Land, in Ukraine, and for our families. Pater noster, quies in celis, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra, panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, et dimite nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimittimus debitoribus nostris, et non nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Amen.
Okay, let me then start with asking you to briefly introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about your background, your family background, your journey to faith, your conversion to Catholicism.
How old am I? I am 39. I was born in the Lake District in Cumbria, in the very northwest of England. And then we moved down to a town called Preston in Lancashire. So this is a part of the country near Manchester, near Liverpool. Very traditional Catholic heartlands of Britain, both because the Reformation didn't really penetrate that far away from, the centres of kind of London, but also because of a huge amount of Irish immigration, but then all other kinds of immigration. Although actually much of this has now waned in quite a very significant way, which I'm sure we'll come to talk about. So I was raised not Catholic, not Christian, not anything, not baptized, which even in the 1980s in Britain it was very common to sort of just be baptized, often as a member of the Church of England, Anglican, or often as Catholic or something, but that be sort of the limit of one's religious upbringing, just to be baptized. But we weren't even that. Went to in Britain we have Catholic schools and Anglican schools and these are state schools. These are sort of free schools, but we also have non-faith free schools. I went to the non-faith ones, so very little kind of religious input apart from what you might call a very weak cultural Christianity, sort of still a vestige, a kind of a relic from a much more religious time in the culture. Went to university as an atheist to study archaeology and ancient history. A few weeks in, wasn't enjoying it as I thought I would, so I decided I wanted to do philosophy, which I'd done at the last 2 years of high school. Any other university in the country where you could do philosophy, I could just have done philosophy on its own. At the University of Oxford, you can't just do philosophy. You have to do it with maths or with physics or with politics and economics. So things I was either not qualified to do it with or had no interest in doing it with. So the only thing I could do with philosophy was theology. So I thought, well, fine, I'll do the minimum theology, the maximum philosophy, and I'll go off and become a philosopher. But of course, this was the first time I'd ever read a gospel, first time I'd ever really had to seriously engage with the Christian intellectual tradition, and really the first time I'd ever kind of hung out, gone drinking with serious, committed, intelligent Christians. So a long period of time, I ended up becoming fascinated by it for a start, which became a master's, which became a doctorate in Catholic, 2 sentences of Lumen Gentium from Vatican II. And then I got to the point when I could kind of, I was believing it, so I had to kind of go and do something about it. So I was baptized in Rome in 2008. And then my wife, who'd been raised Anglican in quite a low-level way, she then joined the church a couple of years after me.
Okay, so this is fascinating. You joined the religion through the intellect, through reason.
Partly. So there was kind of two things. There was obviously an intellectual journey, a very serious one. Mm-hmm. But also, I'm enough of a sociologist to know that I was also drinking with Dominicans. I was hanging out with people who took it seriously, that kind of, teachers and witnesses, this kind of, being socialized and being invited to mass, going along and being kind of brought into a community. So it was those two things together.
Okay, very interesting. So, and so you were studying theology, and was it a Catholic theology, or was it?
There's not a lot of Catholic theology at Oxford.
All right, so it was Anglican, Protestant.
Yeah, I mean, well, a lot of because it was philosophy and theology. You didn't do sort of a comprehensive, systematic course in anything. So you did a fair bit of New Testament, a lot of patristics, and then I, just because of the particular papers I chose to study, then didn't do anything until the 19th century when I did a paper on Dostoevsky. Mm-hmm. But modern theology, the modern theology paper that everyone had to do was, there was Rana, there was Skillabakes, there was a bit of von Balthasar, but it was very early 20th century German Protestants.
Okay. So
Bart, Brunner, that generation.
So how did you decide? What was the main factor of deciding to become a Catholic rather than, Anglican or?
Yeah, it was several things. I think one of the things that attracted me very early on was the early church and the patristic period and reading the lives of the early martyrs. I remember that very early on in my first couple of months of studying, reading the martyrdom of St. Polycarp, reading the letters of St. Ignatius of Antioch and being very kind of moved and impressed and kind of intrigued. And so I think the early church witness was always very important to me. And therefore, looking, where is the sort of the natural continuation of that into the present? Well, I think if I was probably studying in Greece or Russia, I might have looked at the obvious place to look would have been the Orthodox Church, but where I was, the obvious modern continuation was always the Catholic Church. And I think also, and this has only sort of struck me in retrospect, I did find I don't know if you call it an aesthetic pull, an attraction to Catholic piety, to saints, to Catholic devotion, to Catholic, going to the first mass I ever went to was the Dominicans in Oxford, and being, not knowing at all what was going on with chant, but being quite taken by it. So I think I was always drawn to a Catholic expression of Christianity, as well as I think all of the theologians I was particularly interested in and drawn to were either early church or in the modern period. I mean, Dostoevsky was one, but beyond that, it was always, it just happened to be Catholic. So that became a master's on Rana, which led to a doctorate on Vatican II. So that was kind of the natural progression.
Okay.
I mean, I did go to Anglican services as well, and but no, it was always, I always felt if I was gonna become a Christian, I kind of had to do it properly.
I think it was Cardinal Newman who said that to get into history of the church is to get to the Catholic Church, to Catholicism.
Yeah, and of course I kind of started with the history because I hadn't been brought up in a version of Christianity at all, and so starting from the Gospels and the early church, it was a very natural pathway into the Catholic Church.
And was your wife, or is she a Christian? Is she a Catholic as well? And was she Catholic when you?
She was baptized Anglican. She started coming to mass with me. And
when you were married already?
Before we were married. And she'd been raised in quite. It's quite difficult to explain. Well, I mean, there's lots of Polish people who know England very well, but there's a sort of a low-level anti-Catholicism weaved into English history and culture, because of the Reformation, because of all the particular political history. So I think you sort of, unless you happen to be Catholic, then you've imbibed certain anti-Catholic prejudices. Yeah. Catholics believe this, or Catholics are, whatever. And actually, so talking to, very bright Dominican students in Oxford, after drinks and dinner, and then sort of like, well, what about this? Why do you Catholics believe this? And, them saying, oh, well, that's a very interesting question. However, if you read Thomas, then, and actually that was very important. Yeah, exactly. So I think she had been to church because she'd been to Anglican schools, but she was sort of brought back into Christianity and a serious version of it through going on to Catholic stuff and being brought in that way.
Well, very interesting. So you hold 2 PhDs in theology and sociology.
Yes.
You are a researcher, teacher, writer, journalist, husband, a father, and I presume a traveler between Australia and Britain. How do you manage all this? How do you prioritize? and where does salvation come into this place?
Yes. Well, hopefully with fear and trembling, eventually at the end of it, after a long spell in purgatory. I think I was drawn. I mean, the way I've sort of come to the particular, worked on the particular topics I have gone into sociology after my theological studies. A lot of it, a bit like with my conversion, there's a way of looking at it as accident and a way of looking at it as providence.
Yes.
And my theology doctorate was on 2 sentences in the Vatican II the dogmatic constitution on the Church, Lumen Gentium. And
what were these sentences?
Sorry?
What were these 2 sentences?
So this is 2 sentences in Lumen Gentium 16 on the salvation of non-Catholics, but there's 2 particular sentences about even the possibility of salvation for atheists and agnostics, essentially. And so my doctorate was looking at how you could square those two sentences with what Lumen Gentium says a couple of paragraphs earlier about the necessity of faith, baptism, and the church for salvation. But in order to do that, I had to obviously read and think a lot about a much bigger theology of atheism and unbelief and secularity that was happening prior to the council and around the council. But also a much bigger kind of trying to understand the world of atheism and unbelief and secularity today, because I decided that if I was going to do work on the theology of anything, I'd want to read the philosophy of it and the psychology of it and the sociology and the history. And so it happened that there was very little sociology of atheism, at least in English, that had been done. This was about 15, 20 years ago. But it was a time when atheism this was when the new atheism and Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and suddenly atheism was an interesting social phenomenon. So, and literally it was exactly the period I was doing this doctorate. So it suddenly became kind of socially interesting, which is why I got drawn into sort of thinking about it sociologically along the side of thinking about it dogmatically. But then obviously, coming from a very non-religious culture and having been an atheist and becoming a Catholic, and quite a keen, committed new Catholic, I became very interested in the new evangelization. So trying to theologize about the new evangelization in my particular context, it was very useful to understand it all from a sociological perspective. So that became more and more of my work being in the sociology of both kind of the non-religious world, but also then of the church. And so more and more of my work became sociological, which actually has worked very well. And a lot of the work I've done, I think, even when I'm not specifically doing theological work, I think a lot of the work I'm doing on the sociology of atheism or the history of atheism is actually a very useful, the sorts of things the church should understand if it wants to be successful, either in evangelizing people or preventing more people raised Catholic or Christian becoming non-religious. Okay, so this is that whole secularization thing. So the two parts of my the theology and the sociology, but also the Catholicism and the understanding the non-religious, have worked very well together in the present moment, kind of where we are as a church and a society, I think.
Okay, and so you are studying people who believe and who do not believe, who lose their religion. Is religiosity, according to you, a natural state, or is it something that is culturally imposed? Is it driven by the society?
Yeah, well, I think that there's a kind of a combination. I think there is. It's hard to. Well, first of all, it's hard to know because we never exist outside of culture. So there's all, we're always culturally influenced wherever we are. I think what we tend to see is that as kind of traditional religion recedes and diminishes, people don't suddenly all become materialist atheists. Okay, so that's not to say that everyone becomes something in a very serious way religious, but you find all sorts of odd bits of kind of weak paganism or odd bits of spiritual beliefs or that aren't necessarily thought through, but manifest them at kind of big moments or when people die or something like this. But the trouble for the church, there's a danger that the churches say, well, these people aren't atheists. These people, all these non-religious people, they're not really atheists. Therefore, we can kind of count them as as really being one of us because they're not actual atheists. But actually, that's kind of ridiculous, because the church doesn't come to create vaguely weakly superstitious people. Like that's what the church originally came to take people out of. So I think that where we are as societies now is that we have a huge range, even among the people who say they have no religion. You know, that can mean everything from being a very kind of clearly thought through philosophical atheism to believing in some kind of God, to believing in something that looked quite a lot like, if not the fully Christian God, at least a kind of a monotheistic deist kind of thing, to believing in all sorts of odd things. And it's just a huge, you know, half the population of Britain say they have no religion. So kind of thinking about, well, what do non-religious people believe or not believe is actually very complicated. But in the same way is that we have a lot of people who say that they are Christians who also believe a very wide range of not necessarily very Christian things as well. And this is kind of the nature of secularizing societies, I think.
Yeah, it was one of the questions I wanted to ask you. Like, when a person stops believing in God or in Jesus Christ and Christian God, where do they go? Do they become, thought through atheists? Do they just replace it with daily routines, with the grazing and digesting and stuff like that? Or do they resort to something that actually can make up a religion of sorts, but a pagan religion, based on fetishes, amulets, and things like that?
Well, I think all of those things are possible, and I think that there's a kind of, I think that the last thing that you mentioned, this kind of low-level
shamanism.
Yeah, again, I think the trouble that we have is that when we talk about paganism or shamanism or the occult, they all have kind of a capital letter, and it sounds as though it is itself a fully worked through new worldview and system that people are embracing to replace the one that maybe their grandparents had. The parents probably didn't. And actually, it's a much more weakly held thing. But I think that there is a lot of that. If you actually talk to people, what do they believe? Or if you, I mean, one of the interesting things sociologically was that when the Queen died, which was obviously a huge thing, but if you then went to, and I happened to be walking past in London where all the flowers and the cards and the pictures and the Paddington Bear, I don't know if you know Paddington Bear.
Yes.
But people were leaving those, like buying a Paddington Bear and taking it as a votive offering, like very strange. Yeah. But if you sort of paused to read the cards people had written, paused to kind of think about the ways in which people were expressing their grief, there was a very strange mix of quasi-Christian views. People often you'll see this in kind of people becoming angels. She's joined the angels now, or obviously a lot of talk of heaven, which we get, but all kinds of odd sort of bits of again. It's hard to say where it's come from, but there's just kind of like low-level bits of odd beliefs about things that most people don't. It's not that they've kind of become a neo-pagan or they've embraced Mithraism or they've embraced a previous or an existing metaphysical system. But there's certain bits of them added together with certain bits of Christianity, added together with certain bits of other things, karma or something, that people kind of mash together when they need it.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. It seems like people have still a need and a yearning for religion. It's just that they don't have the knowledge.
Yeah,
what
no,
they should believe.
or kind of have. So it was interesting. People left candles. Now, some people who left candles had obviously gone to the church piety stall and got like an enormous Our Lady of Chesterhover candle, right? And Our Lady of Lourdes. Maybe they had it as a souvenir and they brought that. Yeah. Other people had clearly just gone to their bathrooms and got one of these scented aromatic candles. Mm-hmm. But they clearly felt that it was appropriate to bring a candle. The candle is how you mark a death in some way. But they clearly didn't quite know how or why or what was appropriate or where to get such a candle. So there was a lot of that. It was very, very interesting.
Yeah, so it seems like sort of a magic procedure. You know that you need to do something, and that something is actually going to perform something. It's not the belief, the faith that goes behind it.
Something that there's something appropriate to do, mm-hmm. But no one has the script of what to do and how to do it right. I suppose.
Right, and I was going to ask you also, what are the main reasons why people go away from organized religion? And sort of a sub question to that is: do you see, through your research, do you see a difference between the religiosity of people in rich and poor areas of the same country? Is there such a difference? And then what other sort of reasons there might be for abandoning religion?
So I mean, I've looked at this in Britain, and I've looked at it in America. I just published a book quite recently trying to understand. There's been a big rise in people who were raised with some kind of Christian upbringing in America who now tick no religion, and it's gone from single digits, 8-9% in the 90s to kind of about a third of the population now and growing and growing. Mm-hmm. So it's happened much faster in America than it did in Western Europe. And I think that there's a lot going on. So in Britain and in parts of America, the classic pattern is that you have to go back maybe now to great-grandparents or certainly grandparents until you go back to people who really believed a kind of a substantial version of Anglicanism or Methodism or Catholicism and practiced it. And then their children, for all sorts of reasons after the war, were then raised in a very different world, a much less religious world, and raised, and the baby boomers kind of all come of age at the same time in the 1960s, and everything changes. And then their children, if you like, Generation X, were probably still raised, still baptized, still taken to church sometimes, but it was much less of a big part of their upbringing. Mm-hmm. And then when they come to have children, which were the millennials and the Generation Z, they've been raised with kind of so little religion that they don't even feel that there's a cultural or a family or a ethnic reason to still even think of themselves. It's become so distant from any kind of real option for them, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so for a lot of those people, there's not really a particular reason why they've left, because they were never really there to begin with. And so we've got this kind of it's been a generational half-life or a waning, with each generation less religious, creating a less religious generation until you get to a point when you've got a generation for whom it just means nothing, so it's no longer the case that they'll think, well, I'm Irish, therefore we're Catholic, and it's always been an important part of who we are and we always went to church with the nuns and all that kind of that world. You know, that's not even their parents' life. That was their grandparents maybe who had that. And there's all sorts of reasons why that happened. Partly it's to do, as I say, partly it's to do with, for Catholics particularly, a breakdown of small kind of working class Catholic enclaves, so subcultures, ghettos in inverted commas, that you'd have, you know, all the Irish Catholics would live in a certain part of town and they'd all go to church within sort of 3 streets of where they lived, and everyone they knew was Catholic, and the only time they met someone who they might end up going to marry was at a Catholic event in another parish or anything like that. And those subcultures broke down after the Second World War for slum clearances and people becoming middle class and going off to university for the first time and all sorts of reasons. There's a lot of other stuff too, but so there's a kind of a long history, and then there's kind of, well, something finally happens when people no longer even feel a vague cultural attachment. But what you do find alongside of that is that the sexual abuse crisis has often given people who had a very weak attachment to the church. You might have been baptized and gone to Catholic schools, but they weren't properly catechized. They probably never went to church on a Sunday. You know, they didn't have prayers at bedtime and family rosary and processions and pilgrimages that their grandparents or maybe even their parents had had. So when the abuse crisis happens, all they have is very awful things about the church, and they've got nothing really solid or positive to counteract it. Whereas I think for people who were practicing and believing and embedded in the church, the abuse crisis hurts them more because it's far more close to them. But they also have plenty of other reasons to stay and to realize that it's not all priests, it's not the whole church, it's not everyone. So I think that the abuse crisis, and you see this in America too, gives people who might still have, if you like, ticked the box, but only had a very weak attachment to no longer, you know, to not want to associate themselves with a church that they have very little to do with anyway, and probably never had much to do with. And now, you know, why would you want to identify with that, you know, when it's known as a criminal pedophile organization or something? So I think that's when the abuse crisis kind of kicks in. Now, the counter to this are all the way, and the reason why the Catholic churches, I mean, the numbers have fallen, but compared to the Church of England, you know, they've not fallen nearly as far, is immigration. So we've constantly had this new, after the war, I mean, Polish immigration after the Second World War, but also Ukrainians and Hungarians and Maltese and you know, every country. And then we've had large numbers of people coming from India, from the Philippines, from West Africa. With the EU, obviously, they've got a lot more Poles. Well, we've had a lot of Ukrainians come recently with the war. So the community in Britain has always been kind of topped up with immigration, you know, as it had without the Irish beforehand. So there's always this kind of generational weakening that's always been mitigated by new immigrants. But then what we do with those new immigrants is then assimilate their kids into the system. And so, you know, that's the problem we've got at the minute. We need to do better with keeping we're doing a much better job with the people we've got, the committed ones we have in this generation, and how to improve things for the next generation. But there's a more positive side to this as well, but that's probably enough to talk about now.
Right. So the immigration factor is kind of hiding what is actually happening.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It would be far, 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 far worse
Would it be the same as the Anglican Church, or would it be worse?
Well, no. So the Anglican Church, I mean, there was a period in the 1960s when, with the breakdown of the empire, we got people come from the Caribbean and parts of the old empire, where the Church of, the Anglican Church of Uganda or the Anglican Church in Jamaica or wherever came into the church. But the Anglican Church doesn't, there's not all these Anglican countries, all these very religious Anglican countries in the world, because of course there aren't, sending immigrants to Britain. And Protestant immigrants from Africa, say, tend to be a very charismatic, Baptists or Pentecostals. So there's churches that are growing because of immigration that aren't Catholic churches, but these tend to be, Pentecostal or Baptist mega church type things. So the Church of England really doesn't get many immigrants. Whereas for Catholics, we've got Catholics from all over the world, much more religious countries than us, constantly coming in.
And coming back to my question about the sort of level of affluence, if you will.
Yes, sorry, forgot.
So when people get rich, so when they come to England, let's say those pious Catholics from Italy and Poland and Spain, when they come to England, do they lose their faith because they're sort of built into the system, or because they become affluent and they think like they need God less?
Yeah, I think there's two things that happen, and there's been very interesting studies done, particularly on the Polish community in Britain, because it's big, and also it's very organized with Polish parishes and the Polish missions. So you can find Polish Catholics very easily because you just go to particular churches. What you tend to find is that immigration tends to kind of go one of two ways. People either become more religious, or because so much of sort of the home culture and food and language and comforts of home and support networks and job networks are bound up with religion. So if I'm a young Polish immigrant, an obvious place to find other Polish people is the Polish Mass with the Polish Cultural Centre. And, I went to a Polish Mass in Oxford a few days before, it was like the last Sunday of Advent before Christmas. And, there was the oplatki, is that the wafers, the platki, is that what they're called? Yeah. So there were those. There was, obviously a lot of Polish literature, but there was also, warm clothes that people were leaving for people. There was, Polish notices of people looking for work or people looking for accommodation. So religious communities are very often important and help people adapt, and therefore people become more religious. And when they have children, those communities are often the place where they want the children to go to learn the language and the customs and to kind of remember the old country, even though they're obviously, they have British accents and they, don't, but when Granny comes around from Warsaw, they wanted to know that they can speak Polish and that kind of stuff. So they have that effect. But a large proportion of immigrants become much less religious when they come. And it's partly to do with who immigrates. So if it's mainly young men and women, 20s, 30s, they tend to be less religious anyway. But also, they're very often working very long hours. They're there to earn money, so they're happy to work overtime on Sundays, and they might not live anywhere near, a Polish community. You have to live within cities really for those kind of communities, or they might feel like finally, no one notices if I'm not at Mass on a Sunday. And when it's Christmas and Easter, I'll take a selfie and send it back to my mother. And I've seen people do that. At the Ukrainian cathedral, I've seen young men turn up, sort of stand there for 2 minutes and take a selfie and then leave. So it becomes very easy to, no longer kind of get out of the habits of home and to have your freedom and not have to go to mass, and therefore you don't. And then even if you don't mean to never go again, it becomes a new habit. And then especially if you then, marry somebody who isn't Polish or, who isn't a churchgoer themselves in a country like Britain, it's very easy to, it's very unusual to go to church. So, you have to kind of mean to go to church. So it has one of two effects. Either makes people, embeds them more deeply into the church, or they'll probably still send the kids to the Catholic school to get them baptized, first, as they'd want to, because it's important to them, and certainly to grandmothers back home it's important. But you may very well not see them at mass every Sunday.
Right. So if these kind of phenomena are happening in a society, is there a pattern that they follow? In other words, I presume that England and some other Western countries, in terms of speed of secularization, are a couple of decades ahead of us. Is there a pattern of events that follow an increased speed of secularization, something that we would be able to watch out for, try to prevent?
No, this is an excellent question. I think that we've had lots of if you like, natural experiments of how secularization happens in different countries. Britain is sort of at the 50, 60 years into secularization or more. America's about 20, 30 years, and it's happened very fast. In Britain, it happened very slow. Well, not very slow, but slower. But if we look across Europe, if we look at the countries that have significantly become less religious, Ireland is a different case again. We do see that every country is different, because each of the, even countries that are look very similar in terms of history and culture and language, can go very different directions because of the precise mix and the politics and the religious mix. So, Catholic countries tend to do something different to Protestant countries in general. So I think that Britain probably won't be a very good model of how things might play out in Poland, because Poland is and has been for a very long time a country much more like Ireland, really, or Malta. One of the real outliers of not just religiousness but Catholic devotional piety and politics and all sorts of ways. If Ireland is a model, then things can turn very fast. But it's worth remembering that Ireland is still one of the most religious countries in Europe. Church attendance in Ireland is still one of the highest in Europe. This is something that we miss. And when I was in Poland where was I? Breslau.
Okay. Wrocław.
Yeah. Yes. I was there in 2019, I think. And I was presenting a report. I'd done a report looking at young adults, the religiosity of young adults across Europe in all different countries. And a Polish doctoral student called Radek Michalski asked to translate it into Polish, and we did a specific kind of Polish-focused chapter. And I went to Poland to present this, and And yes, you know, the young, I forget what the figures were, but young adults in Poland were much less religious than, you know, their parents had been.
Yes.
But it was still vastly more religious than anywhere else, kind of almost in the world, let alone elsewhere in Europe. So I think that, and it's the same with Ireland. So I think that what happens is that if you're in the church in Poland, you're comparing how things are now to how they were 30 years ago in Poland. And it's the same in Ireland. You know, if you're comparing Ireland's Catholicism now with what it was 30 years ago. But still, kind of compared to almost anywhere else in the world, Ireland is still a very religious country. Poland is a very religious country. But obviously, the worry is the direction of travel. And I think...
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think that the very religious cultures can turn quite quickly in sort of the space of a single generation, which we've seen in America.
But is it possible to prevent that slide or reverse it? Have you seen any evidence that in any country that you study that was done?
Well, first of all, there are countries that it hasn't happened. Now, you don't know if it hasn't happened yet, or if it hasn't happened. And so some of the countries where we used to say it hasn't happened yet, it has now happened, like America, it seems to have started, right. Ireland. But that's not to say that all of the other countries where it hasn't happened, it will. Okay. I think what we're beginning to see in Britain, and I'm writing a book at the moment arguing this, is that we're beginning to see things. First of all, things are either things are gonna, secularization can't continue forever. It's a process, right? There's got to come a point when you're as secularized as you can get. And that won't be zero, it won't, there will never come a point where there is no one in Britain who goes to church. It won't come to a point that there are no Catholics in Britain. There are no, there's nothing. So the question is, how low does it go when it stops? And once it stops, it can either kind of hold vaguely steady, or it can start to gradually go up again. Mm-hmm. I think we're not there yet, but I think we're beginning to get to what you might call peak secularization in Britain. That we're getting to a point where there's not really any lower that things will go. And that's the critical point now for the church, to think, how do we ensure that our lowest point is as high as it can be? Because if that's zero, you want it to, whether you end up there before you start going up or there before you start going up is a big difference. But then when we get down to the kind of the bottom, the question then is, what kind of position are we in to start to grow again? And the reason why this happens is because if you're in your 20s or your 30s in Britain, especially if you were raised in Britain, then if you're going to church on a Sunday, you have to be there for a reason. You have to have been swimming against the tide. G.K. Chesterton says it takes a living thing to swim against the stream, Yeah. You have to know why you're there. You have to have argued with, not only your friends and family, but, probably a bit of yourself as to, why am I going? Do I really believe it? Do I really subscribe to what the church teaches? And what you find is that there is actually quite significant subcultures, if you like, of highly committed young Catholics who do believe it and do believe what the church teaches and do think that this is a wonderful, life-giving, joyful thing. You see this at university Catholic societies, for example. And they're either, they then marry each other and then go and raise, intentionally Catholic families, often bigger, much bigger than the normal average of a family in Britain. But also they're the kind of communities that start to attract people again. Mm-hmm. So I think we're starting to get to the point in Britain where we're going to start seeing, we're already beginning to see it. We're beginning to see it underneath the surface of the top line statistics that we're going to start seeing growth again.
Okay. Go ahead.
But of course, for where Poland is, if Poland is continuing to decline, it's going to be a long way off until you to reach there, I guess.
Yeah. It's just a question of, can we stop it, the decline at the level that is acceptably high for us? And let me ask you this: did you have studies about the impact of COVID on religiosity, on the lockdowns, the vaccinations, the behavior of the clergy, and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated. I mean, I wrote a little book very early into COVID about, published by Bishop Barron's Word on Fire thing. Basically trying to look back at the church and pandemics in the past, because of course pandemics have been a very kind of normal part of human history, and many of the great saints of the past lived through pandemics, sometimes several, and ministered in them heroically, or with suffered for life through them or something, that this was a very normal thing. And it was always difficult to know quite how COVID would affect the church. Certainly, church going took a very big hit that it hasn't recovered from. So before COVID, 2019, October 2019 was when the last October is when the annual mass count happens in Catholic parishes. It was about 700,000 in church on a typical Catholic Sunday in England and Wales in 2019. In 2022, it was 500,000. So we've kind of lost 200,000 people, which is huge. That's
huge.
And it, by now, if they're coming back, they'd have come back. But again, what we don't know is how many of that is people who have stopped going. How many of that is immigrants who would have come but haven't because of Brexit? Because of course Brexit happens in the middle of this as well. So there's a lot going on. But certainly, I think it's had a bigger. Partly, it killed a lot of people, and the people it killed are the demographic most likely to be churchgoers, old people.
Right. And so the influence of the pandemic on religiosity is counterintuitive, if you ask me. I think it completely opposite to what happened during the Antonine Plague of 150.
Yeah, so what you tend to see when there's a big crisis is that people become more religious. So you get this after the First World War, for example. You get this after the American Civil War. You get this kind of revival, almost.
Right.
And we certainly haven't seen that, or at least we haven't. If there has been a revival, it hasn't happened in the mainstream churches,
right.
In any kind of societal way. I think what probably has happened is that for individuals, the pandemic will have, what we'll find when we have vocation stories, lots of them will say, well, the pandemic was the thing that set me on a new path. And that was when I realized that I might have a vocation. I think when we read hagiographies in 200 years' time, we'll have them that the pandemic was an important part of why they became who they became. But as a big societal thing, it hasn't happened. It may be that the people who had those kind of big existential crises, or were suddenly asking big questions that they hadn't had to confront before, it may be that, if they're sitting in front of a computer in lockdown, typing things into Google, the places they ended up, were some kind of odd, new age something, or but they certainly didn't end up in Catholic or Anglican churches in any big way.
Okay, and let me ask you about this. You wrote about Vatican II, and if I understand you correctly, sort of defend the thesis that Vatican II was not the sole issue or not the biggest issue that caused the decline of religiosity among Catholics, but there were some fundamental things that were done at that time that sort of did hurt the religiosity. Could you name a couple of them? Like, what were the biggest?
So yeah, that's the book. Basically, the argument is that it's not all Vatican II. There's a lot that happens around in the 1960s. There's an awful lot happening that would have happened anyway, that would have affected Catholic. And the reason why Vatican II was called, this is a big part of the argument, is there was a clear growing pastoral crisis in places like Belgium, France, the Netherlands, Italy, Germany. And, if you read Rana, if you read Ratzinger in the 50s, if you read Congar and de Lubac in the 1930s in France, or Cardinal Cardine in Belgium, that there's a very clear sense that we're losing the young and we're losing the working classes and we need to do something about it. Something needs to change. So a lot of that was all, and of course, all those people and all those places are the ones who then were so influential at the council itself. And both popes of the council, we know that they were also worried about precisely these things as well before the council. So one of the arguments is that it's not the case that everything was perfect and then the church, Vatican II comes and it all goes downhill. Vatican II is trying to fix the problems. Now, the fact that the fixes it brings in obviously haven't worked because things have gone much worse.
Yeah, so
I think that's the thing that, that there's a sense in which the council fails, because what the council does is say there's all these problems that we need to address now in order that we don't suddenly lose huge amounts of the laity in Western Europe and other places. And then we did, and probably lost more than we would have done anyway. So I think one of the big arguments of the book is that, and this isn't really the council's fault, is that the particular time, if you had to pick a moment in the past 500 years of history to make pastoral changes in something like, laboratory conditions, like with keeping everything else equal, let's change a few things and see what happens. The 1960s was probably the worst possible moment to do that, because it was a time of turbulence and change and everything was changing. And the baby boomers were all coming of age at the same time. And we had civil rights, and we had the sexual revolution, we had the pill, and we had Vietnam, and we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, we had all sorts of stuff happening. So it was a very turbulent period anyway. And at a time like that, what you really want is for the church to be the stable thing, the one thing that doesn't change, the one thing that, or if it does change, changes very carefully and slowly, and making sure that each change is a positive one and well thought through, and you don't suddenly do radical things. And one of my arguments in a book called Mass Exodus is that not only did everything change very fast, but there was a whole period after the council. And then this is particularly in Britain and America, which was the focus of the book, but different parts of the world would have been very different. But it wasn't just that the liturgy changed. There was a sort of a period of about 10 years when it changed week to week, and from parish to parish. And every time you turned up for Mass, you had no idea, what was going to happen, with music, with, which bits might be in English, which way the priest would be facing, where Jesus had been moved to in the tabernacle, where the altar was, what had happened to altar rails. So there's a very turbulent period, which is bad for any organization. I mean, any organization trying to change something, you know, if you went to a supermarket, and it's not the best analogy, it's annoying when they change the layout, but you get used to it. But if they changed it every week, there'd come a point when you stopped going to that supermarket.
Yeah.
You know, and it'd just be chaos. And I think that the trouble was, particularly with this baby boom generation, is that they were at an age when they were least likely to be in any one place at any one time and to be going to church on a Sunday, because they'd be going off to university, they'd be going off, you know, but by the time they then settled down to have their own children, they'd never really acclimatized to the new normal, and they'd got out the habit, and it was all different anyway, and everything had changed. So I think that's one of the big arguments, and also one of the big arguments of the book, and I think Poland escaped much of this, was we got rid of a huge amount of stuff that was thought to be a distraction from the mass: rosaries, pilgrimages, novenas, chaplets, you know, that whole rich Catholic world of devotional life, that it was felt, if you get rid of that, then people can just focus on the mass on a Sunday. But actually what we've realized is that was the scaffolding that kind of kept everything else up. And so once you got rid of that, then there was very little else holding people's piety up. And the countries, and this is true of the immigrant groups that you see, you know, the styles of Catholicism that are the strongest and the most committed and the most vital, and places like Poland, are places like the Philippines, are places like Vietnam, are places like, you know, parts of West Africa, where there's still a very devotional style of Catholicism, with rosaries, with, you know, pilgrimages, with praying to saints. And we lost all that. And we lost it all very quickly. No one really planned to get rid of everything all at once. But we sort of did it by accident. Because I think there was a lot of very naive, bad sociology, really bad anthropology and sociology that thought, well, let's change this. Let's change the liturgy in this way. Let's get rid of Latin. Let's get rid of the smells. Let's get rid of the music. Let's make it all relevant and make it make more sense to people. And actually, it didn't work. I mean, it just didn't work. And so I think a lot of, but it's not, you know, you then read you read Sacrosanctum Concilium. It's not that Sacrosanctum Concilium says we need to get rid of the rosary, we need to get rid of this and this, you know, like, it doesn't say that. But there was a sense in which it unleashed this chaos.
Yeah, I guess it created an atmosphere of permission.
Yeah, and getting rid of fish on Fridays was this, you know, like,
that only happened a few years ago in Poland.
Yeah, but they got rid of it because they thought, well, people don't do it for the right reasons. They don't understand why they do it, and it would be better if we said they could choose. They could either fast or they could do a good work, but and make them think it through and own it and embrace it. But of course, all people took from it was, oh, we can eat meat now. Yeah. Fridays are just like every other day. Yeah. And actually, it's things like that actually have this kind of big effect. But the other thing is that then people thought, well, if fish on Fridays can change, if the mass can change, well, anything can change. And then Humanae Vitae didn't change. And then that became a huge thing, in a way that after Casti Connubii, there wasn't a big fallout, because no one expected that the church could change its teaching on, you know, the church doesn't change at all, which again is wrong. But if anything can change, and everyone had been told that it would change, and then it didn't change, then that becomes a massive thing. And that was all, the fact that everything changed, but the church's teaching on contraception. That became the thing that people then crashed into, because everything else was moving around it.
Of course.
Can I ask here one question? Isn't because of building up expectations? Because you remember there were two commissions preparing the document for the Pope Paul VI on the contraception, and they were heavily influenced by Anglican Church, because as you remember, the declaration of the
Lambeth Conference,
Lambeth Conference in 30s, which the response to which was the Casti Connubii. And then we had this development of contraceptive in 50s, actually with the participation of one Polish doctor in US. And then there were two commissions, and and some of the members of the commission, very recognized moral theologians, switched the sides, and they joined the liberal side. And there was a kind of building up expectation through the leakage to the press, to the media, and people thought really that there will be major change in the Catholic teaching. This was already prepared.
Yep.
And then there was this
priest had been telling couples marriage preparation. There's no point. There's no. They're going to change it anyway. So there's no point.
Yeah.
Even
and then
practicing it until they do.
Yeah. And then the bishops and the priests, just after Humanae Vitae, just revolted. Look at the Benelux bishops. Look at the Canadian bishops. Some parts of the U.S. bishops. They were dissenters, in fact, and they taught the laity that they can follow the conscience. This was the common message. Don't you see analogies? We are living now in turbulent time. The church is in crisis, and we face today something which is small equivalent of this Vatican II in form of synod on synodality. We've got very unstable teaching. We've got very, I would say, dramatic society situation and cultural change, and church is now, instead of being supportive and stable kind of platform, it sends various signals. I mean, this is the perception of many people. I mean, that we've got certain ambiguity in teaching. No, don't you think there is analogy in that?
No, I do. I quite agree. I think that the difficulty is that we have, like, the going earlier, the synod on the families, whether the final Amoris Laetitia permitted communion for the divorced and remarried was not clear in the document. And then we have this kind of very strange period in which kind of papal teaching is kind of done through, leaks to the press by people close to the Pope saying that actually this is what it really means. And it's that almost, it almost felt that there was an intended ambiguity to kind of get out of the, without having to say that we changed it, but there was giving enough leeway to allow people to interpret it how they wanted to interpret it. And I agree that that's a really, really bad way to do things. I don't think you can change those kind of teachings, actually. But if you could and you were to, it'd be much better to actually do it properly rather than have this chaos. Because then what happens, and this happened with Humanae Vitae, is that you'd have, a same parish in the same confessional. One priest would tell you using artificial contraception is the mortal sin. And, when that priest leaves and the next priest comes in, suddenly it was up to your individual conscience. And you can't have a church that that different authority figures. And for the laity, the parish priest is really, is, if the system works, the parish priest should be the sort of the authority who tells you what any other parish priest tells you, and would tell you what the kind of the Pope would tell you almost. You can't, it doesn't work if kind of truth changes from parish to parish, or from, priest to priest, or bishop to bishop.
I mean, as a
no,
sociologist,
no
you
moral
fully
system can work like this. It's chaos.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even from purely scientific point of view, sociological point of view, a kind of moving sense environment when you don't really you cannot really rely on one clearly explained truth creates such a confusion. We met a couple of guests like Professor Janet Smith, who was telling us that this kind of situation you described, one priest telling one thing in confessional, allowing kind of use of the conscience, so you can, if the conscience allows you, you can use contraceptives. Another say, well, church's teaching is that you shouldn't. This create a kind of I would say ambiguity and confusion. The second point is that very, I would say, easy adoption of certain concepts. I mean, when you read Vatican II documents, they are, in principle, they are pretty solid documents, but they open certain doors because there are certain expressions relating to sciences, especially social sciences. In certain parts, there is a kind of optimistic belief that science can really support church in its teaching, but it was actually prepared, it was issued just a few years ago before the science made a major turnover, the major changes in terms of anthropological setup. I mean, if you look at the current sociology in most of the universities, is very much penetrating by very reductionistic vision of a man. I mean, the man is just naked ape, naked monkey who is treated like any other animal, and there is no this spiritual dimension which is taught by the church. And with this kind of concept, you can use behavioral engineering, you can use various techniques, you can believe that the spirit is imprisoned in body, so you can change your body because if you feel this is not the right body. So we've got this kind, and the church sometimes seems to be a little bit without own message to, because it relies, it believes that the science can help. Don't you think that we need to return to our own anthropology and own sociology without losing the contact with the real developments in science?
Yeah, I do actually. I think we need a theologically informed, if you like, a Christian sociology almost, and obviously that's not a sociology that non-Christians will necessarily, there's a theological anthropology, if you like, that actually does full justice. And it's not impossible within, it's not impossible to do that kind of sociology, but it has to be a kind of an ecclesial sociology. And there are sociologists who kind of, there's a Catholic Society for Catholic Social Scientists, for example, in the States, where the intention is to try and create this ecosystem of Catholic institutions with Catholic sociologists and anthropologists and psychologists who do have a different vision of the human person and therefore of human societies, in the kind of vision that Catholic social, we do have this tradition within the church. I agree, but we can also use kind of very much narrower and theologically inadequate accounts of humanity, of anthropology. And actually, sorry, don't go on.
I mean, we lost somewhat boldness and courage to say that there are various points of view, and every theory has some assumptions, and these assumptions can be questioned. And I mean, and therefore, if you don't have this distance, then you so easily surrender to mainstream kind of, especially in social sciences and humanistic faculties. You so easily surrender to the mainstream, quite anti-Christian, I would say, message narrative. And I believe that probably this is what Bishop Barron is trying to do with Word and Fire, to create a counterpoint. And in one of your interview, I think it was with Larry Chapp, you said that Christianity should be perceived as as something which is countercultural.
Yeah, this is something that Bishop Barron talks about a lot. There's this kind that the Christian worldview, Well, for a start, I mean, there's a kind of a sociological fact about secularized Western societies is that to be any kind of serious religious person is seen as being very weird. I mean, it's a very weird, to be in your 20s or 30s, particularly if you go to church on a Sunday, every Sunday, that puts you in a very kind of tiny segment of your peer group, and it's a very odd, weird thing to do. But there's a sense in which that I think what we see in places like Britain is that actually the people who then do that are doing it for a reason, and they're not doing it in order to be weird, because there's other ways to go and be weird in a society, but actually the reason why you go to mass on a Sunday is because you think it's true, and you think your salvation depends on it, and you think that it's really Christ's presence, and you think that you are obliged to be there, but even if you want to be there, but even if you woke up and didn't feel like you wanted to be there, then you knew that you're obliged to be there because of the church demands it of you, and that's a very weird way of seeing the world compared, it's a bit like in the Gospels, compared to the wisdom of the world. But actually, I think we had a period of the church trying to do things to kind of get rid of Catholic devotions, get rid of the saints, get rid of Fish on Fridays, get kind of rid of things that made us look weird, and to kind of in a sense and to become more like mainstream liberal Protestants, at least in somewhere like America or something, right? Or in Germany, there's this kind of thing, that the mass shouldn't have anything that could offend a Protestant, for example, and we'll have Lutheran hymns, and we'll have it shouldn't be an altar, and it should be like a kind of a lunch table, and it should be very kind of non-threatening to people and instantly understandable. The trouble is that those churches are the ones who've secularized the fastest. The churches that have done most to make them to kind of change with the wider culture, and to do everything to make them seem like they're just a normal part of society, like this Anglican cathedrals having raves, having discos in Canterbury Cathedral, which happened a few weeks ago, doesn't attract anyone to become a Christian. Like, it just doesn't. I mean, there's no point going to church if all you get is a bad cover version of secular society. There's got to be something there that's real, that you actually believe, that's worth the effort. Kind of, we need to lean into this kind of embracing the fact that it is it's going to be a culturally odd thing to do, a deviant thing, because of course it is. I mean, it's a radical message, Christianity.
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree, and I think this modern aggiornamento, this assimilation to the culture, to mainstream culture, which is sometimes so alien to the church teaching, might end up with what Christian Smith called moralistic therapeutic deism. I mean, you've got people who just for self satisfaction, for good mood, for development of the personality, just attend services because they think it's better for mental health. Its side effect might be that, but it's not the right reason to go to the church. That's first. No. And the second, about feminists in the church. I mean, I think I read sometimes the principle: the more women in the presbyterium when the priests are celebrating, the less men in the church. I don't know whether you know, because I mean, there is a now tendency to bring more women in various functions to the place when the Eucharist, the transubstantiation, is celebrated, and I see that even if with altar boys, I mean, the more women are becoming altar women, the less boys are attending the service. And I'm just curious how you, from sociological point of view, how you view this adoption of certain or Protestant trends, because it's very common in Anglican Church, or just trends from society. More women in every position in the church, less devotions because it looks like superstition to our friends from Protestant churches. Perhaps we shouldn't be very vocal about contraception because 80-90% of Catholics in US and probably in UK is not following the church teaching. Why should we talk about how don't we lose our identity and the real message of the gospel in that way?
Well, I mean, I agree about the, getting rid of devotions. I agree with the, that we need to downplay certain things because because it's awkward and because the people we're preaching to don't believe it, whatever. I agree. I don't actually agree about the, altar, girls on the altar. My daughter's an altar, for example. I don't think, and I think we should have more women in curial officers. I just think that's a good thing, actually.
No, curia is different.
I mean,
Mm-hmm.
But so, I mean, certainly not in the priesthood or the diaconate. That's a different thing, and that's but I mean, altar servers I have no problem with, or readers or anything like this. I mean, I don't see that as a problem. I think the other issues are. Yes.
I tell you, just from sociological point of view, most of the vacations in our diocese come for many years come from altar boys and readers. Because they were this group they were just boys, and they were meeting regularly. There was some kind of guidance, and nowadays we've got a dramatic drop in vacations. This is more complex issue, of course, because we get some cases of sex abuse, which were more alibi, more kind of pretext for some people to leave the church, but also there is less children in families. I mean, if you've got just one kid, parents can oftentimes resist that their son goes to priesthood. So with many kids, it's more probable that some of them might become religious, right, or priests. So I think that we're living in a society which absolutely do not appreciate, especially contemplative life, because they believe this is not useful life from the utilitarian point of view. With priesthood, if they are socially involved in social justice, they can be accepted. But otherwise, what's the deal with having priests? I mean, from purely secular point of view, and this is very much in culture. I mean, we don't have many films with good priests. I mean, especially with good families. I don't know whether you've noticed that. I mean, how many good films about family life you've seen recently? I mean, mostly the families are either abusive or somewhat immature, or there are problems, whatever. And this creates a kind of atmosphere also for the churchgoers that do not support faithful families and marriages. I don't know whether you see this broader context in your research.
Well, I don't. I mean, I agree with much of what you say. I mean, I do think that we don't have. Certainly, we don't see these sort of positive images of priesthood on the media and TV, and I think that partly I think that the the media reflects or tries to reflect the way families are, and it's not that I mean, there's an awful lot of broken families. I mean, I think that's a huge problem in society. I agree that we struggle for vocations, but I don't, and I haven't seen any research that ties this to altar servers who are girls. I think we can disagree on that specific point. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot there that I agree with.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you this: if it is okay for women to be in the presbytery around the altar, why is it not okay for them to be ordained as priests?
Because Christ never ordained women as priests, and the constant tradition of the church is that women can't be priests.
Right, right. But isn't introduction of in general people to perform service around the altar, and especially women, isn't that just the first step to further demand, that women be ordained as priests? And these demands.
I honestly, I don't see it as a Trojan horse plot. I honestly don't.
Okay.
All
right. Yeah, sure. Just wanted to clarify this point. And so let me ask you a different question. I wanted to ask you about the impact that the mass immigration into the United Kingdom of people of different faith has on Christianity and Christians. So you have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Muslims and for instance Hindus who live in England among the British. What effect does it have on the religiosity of the British? Is it a positive effect, meaning, okay, these people are religious and they're performing their rituals, or is it negative, saying, their religion is more interesting than ours was?
No, I think that there's a very interesting thing is that we don't. I mean, we have had a very significant immigration, particularly from the Indian subcontinent. So, which include a lot of Muslims, a lot of Hindus and Sikhs, but also a lot of Christians, of course, from India.
Yes.
And the Catholic Church has been hugely benefited from the Indian Christian diaspora. I think actually that if it wasn't, there are obviously, there are problems with the integration of small segments of the Muslim population, and there are issues. And I think on the whole, it's a very positive thing because it's a religious presence in a country that is becoming very unused to any kind of religious presence. And also, hopefully, churches will see, I'm not saying they will, but one of the reasons why why Islam is growing in Britain is immigration, but it's also the keeping people to the next generation, for example, in a way that we don't. So there's a much bigger religious input in the family, which we've completely lost in Christian families. You sort of expect that the schools do that or something. There's much higher levels of normative attendance at religious services. Ramadan's coming up, and if Catholics fasted in Lent like Muslims fasted in Ramadan, I think that actually what we, on the whole, I actually think that it's a very positive witness to something that isn't this kind of secular, relativistic, postmodern, whatever it is in the wider culture. What we're not seeing, it's not. There are converts to Islam, and not in huge. It's not that there's all these British, millions and millions of British people who would become Christians who are becoming Hindus or Muslims. There's a significant few who convert to Islam, particularly, less so the other religions. Buddhism is a separate case. But they're really not kind of competing in that respect, I don't think.
Okay. Just wanted to see if there is a sort of any evidence present now that there is a positive influence on religiosity of the English or not. But from what you're saying, I understand that there's hope that it will influence positively how the English are behaving, but right now we can't see that. Okay, and let me ask you a different question. With people from various religions coming into the UK and into other European countries, some of these religions being quite intolerant. and with a growing number of people who are non-believers and who have their certain lifestyles that are very contradictory to what Christians believe, do you expect a persecution of Christians, white or red martyrdom, in the near future because of what they believe and what they refuse to relinquish?
Not in. I think what we are seeing, and this is a very serious problem, and actually this is where other religious groups help us, because there's strength in numbers, and it also allows, there's certain, probably parts of the sort of the liberal elite, if you like, who would quite happily have a go at Christianity, but wouldn't want to say anything Islamophobic or something, right? So actually, this is helpful to us. And actually, there's a lot of, I mean, I think that we are seeing a much, you see this particularly in bioethics, in medical settings. So what in the past was regarded as a perfectly acceptable, on grounds of conscience, if you were a nurse or a midwife, that you wouldn't participate in abortion, for example, or that if you were a doctor that you wouldn't, it was just accepted that even if it's legally, that it's a perfectly kind of acceptable thing for a doctor not to, to refuse to prescribe things. And there was kind of workarounds, and it wasn't ideal because all it was that there'd be another doctor who'd sign it off. But I think what we are beginning to see is that they'll say, no, that's your job. And if you don't do it, then you're not doing your job, so you can't do it. So I think the danger, and I think there'll be a lot of things around LGBTQ, like there's all sorts of human resource policies that, if you're not fully on board with, that you can see down the line, particular views on transgender, you can see that certain views will become to be kind of seen as being like unacceptable for a decent person to believe. Now, it will be the case that a significant proportion of those people with those views will be Christians or will be Muslims or will be so. Not necessarily, though. I think a lot of those kind of culture war issues aren't Christian specific. I mean, I think abortion is a bigger one in that, there's probably certain kind of evangelical Protestants, Catholics, and, Muslims, who are the most likely people to oppose abortion. It's not to say that there aren't any atheists who also do, but that's the biggest contingent. But it's actually very helpful to the Catholic Church to be able to say, this isn't a Catholic issue, because if it was, then everyone would just dismiss it because it's a Catholic. And, Britons have, never liked Catholics. There's always been. Right. But if you can say that this isn't just us, this is all these other groups, that this is a significant sector of society, and this is a kind of a conscience issue for a bigger contingent, then you've got some hope of a greater latitude for those views in kind of polite civil society to have some sort of voice in place. I think we are beginning to see, a very, and you, you'll get, people being, being sacked for wearing crosses and stuff, and things that in the past you just wouldn't dream would be a problem. Or a university chaplain, a friend of mine actually, the university said he couldn't be the chaplain, the Catholic chaplain, because he'd said something against abortion on Twitter. And in fact, the university backed down in the end because there was a big outcry. But the idea that there's certain views that it would be a danger to our students to have someone holding those views, on campus, we're beginning to see more and more of that. I mean, I think, I God willing, I don't see I just don't see any of that. There's plenty of places in the world where red martyrdom is a serious danger on a daily basis, and the church should be doing far more about lobbying and supporting and helping Christians in those countries. And I'm very nervous about equating the kind of the intolerance and the growing social unacceptability of certain Christian beliefs in the West with equating it with places in the world where you are in quite serious danger of being martyred if you're, in the wrong place at the wrong time. And particularly if you're a Catholic politician or, and actually, I don't think it's helpful in a country like Britain, which is a very tolerant and open society. It's not to say there aren't problems, and it's not to say there aren't issues the church needs to be stronger on. But it's a very long way from what exists in much of the world, where we have a very serious problem with a lack of religious freedom. I mean, the kinds of issues faced by serious Christians in Britain or America or France, it's not to say there aren't issues, but it's a very long way away from what it is in Pakistan or Saudi Arabia, or
Nigeria, for that matter, right?
Quite exactly.
But isn't that just a question of numbers? Because we have seen priests being assaulted in Poland, not for religious reasons, but for other reasons, ideological reasons. We have a priest murdered at the altar in France. We have a British politician stabbed to death on his job. So these cases do happen. It's just a question that they do not happen very often.
No, they don't happen very often. And they're horrifying tragedies when they do happen. And I'm in no way trying to sort of downplay the significance of those things that happen when they happen. But they are very rare. And it really isn't, you don't go to mass on a Sunday in Britain worrying that there's going to be a suicide bomb in the parts of the world where actually that might happen.
True.
In far, 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 far more regularly.
Yeah, that's very true. Look, I think we have sort of exhausted the time that you have graciously agreed to devote to our conversation. I would like to ask you for one last thing. Would you care to say a couple of words to our Polish audience, sort of a message, I don't know, a warning, an advice, an observation, whatever feels like right?
Yeah, I think the only thing, and this comes from, I'm doing a project now that I've mentioned before on various signs of hope and resilience within British Catholicism. And a lot of the things I've talked about of this kind of, the people who are there in their 20s, have to be there for a reason, and we're beginning to see things. A big element of that, and it's not perfect, and there's a lot of Polish people who don't go to mass as much as they could or should, or, and then there's all sorts of issues, but actually the Polish contribution to British Catholicism now, but also after the war and the Allied servicemen, the Free Polish and their families, have been a hugely positive benefit to the church in this country. And remember that, the Catholic Church in this country always has been, since the Reformation, a very small minority. And out of the Polish diaspora in Britain, we're getting, British priests with Polish surname. It won't be long until we have, in the same way we have a lot of British bishops with Irish surnames.
Yes.
It won't be long until we start getting British bishops, second, third generation with Polish surnames. And it really is, that the effect that the Polish diaspora has in contributing to and building up not just the Polish parishes, but all of the parishes is a huge kind of, without a kind of a gift to the wider Catholic world. And whatever, I know that you are, there's all sorts of problems and there's issues and there's secularization. But actually, still, Poland is an exporter of serious Catholicism, which is a great benefit to us. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Professor
It
Bullivant.
was a pleasure to have this conversation with you, and I hope we'll have another opportunity, perhaps in the past. We'll wait another 2-3 years.
In
Perhaps
person, maybe.
Okay, thank you.
In person, absolutely. If you plan to visit Warsaw, please let us
Oh,
know.
I will.
All right. Okay.